Welcome all to one more speaker series in person. My name is Christoph Lüttke. I'm the professor of business ethics at TU Munich and the director of the Institute for Ethics in AI. With our speaker series, we invite experts from all over the world to talk about ethics and governance of AI. And these events serve as an important platform for sharing new research and exchanging knowledge. Since our launch in 2019, we were able to hold 33 speaker series and counting, with distinguished guests from all over the world. Today's topic is generative AI's gappiness, meaningfulness, authorship, and the credit-blame asymmetry. And we have the pleasure of having Sven Nyholm with us. Sven Nyholm is newly appointed professor of ethics of artificial intelligence at our sister university or rival university, however you would like it, at LMU Munich. He studied philosophy and got his PhD from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He has been wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter at University of Cologne, and before becoming a professor in the Netherlands, he was professor at TU Eindhoven and University of Utrecht before moving to Munich. He's also principal investigator in the Munich Center for Machine Learning, a member of the Ethics Advisory Board of the Human Brain Project, and associate editor of the journal Science and Engineering Ethics, in which we also published, I think. A recent book is This is Technology Ethics, an Introduction, published by Wiley-Blackwell just very recently, I understand. So we are looking forward to your talk. The floor is yours, Sven.
Well, thank you very much. And I hope that if people are online, that they can hear me. I don't know if there can be any sort of signal if I have to move the mic or anything like that. But in any case, thanks a lot for the introduction, and also thanks a lot for the invitation to give a presentation here today. Yeah, so it's a little bit of a long title, but I'm going to try to talk about all these different parts. And it's not a typo, it's supposed to be gappiness. I'll explain what I mean by that word in just a second. Now, one thing that you didn't mention in the introduction is that although I studied in Michigan, I'm from Sweden, and I'm going to start by talking about something Swedish. And so, in Sweden, we're very proud of ABBA. Yeah, this was 50 years ago, actually 49 years ago, to be more precise. So they won the Eurovision Song Contest with the song Waterloo, I think it was. They were already famous back in Sweden, but this is when they really got well known all over the world. And why am I talking about this? Well, you may know that the songs by ABBA were written by Björn and Benny. And they, in addition to writing all the ABBA hits, they also have written musicals and songs for other people, and it's really quite a catalog of songs that they've been writing. Now, so this again is Björn, and so this was in 1974, I think. Here we have him today, and so he was just interviewed on a music appreciation channel by this guy here, Rick Beato. He interviews people like Björn from ABBA. He had some members of Nirvana he interviewed, and Brian May from Queen, etc., etc. All of these very well-known musicians about their songwriting. And the sort of the topic of this videos is what makes a song great. And so I do sometimes enjoy watching this, but I was particularly fascinated by this interview because instead of going directly to talking about Dancing Queen, which they did, etc., and all these hits from ABBA, they actually spend the first about 10 to 15 minutes talking about generative AI, because in addition to having written all these songs, Björn is also sort of a part of some sort of organization that's looking at the developments for songwriters, with new technologies and their rights, and trying to make sure that people get credited and paid properly. And so obviously generative AI is one of the things that people like him who are interested in that are now interested in. And indeed, they spent about 10 minutes talking about that. And he said that he had been invited to some big tech company, he didn't say which one, that had a very impressive generative AI technologies where you could, as a prompt, you could say, for example, this is his example, compose a song in the style of ABBA with a little bit of Queen and sung by Frank Sinatra, and then the generative AI would play a song like that. It wouldn't be a song that he had written. It would sound as if he had written it, but it would be, well, a new composition, so to speak. And so he was concerned, who exactly then should get the, well, on the one hand, the credit in the sense of the, I don't know, the honor, like, who is the sort of the, in Germany, I guess it would say Urheber of this, then the author, or like the underlying composer, but also who should get paid. That's, of course, another issue. So he's concerned about that. But, I mean, at the same time, he's still an active songwriter, so he is tempted by using these tools. The example he was given, that let's say that he's writing another musical and he has to write a scene where there's a tango, and so tango is not his sort of speciality. So then he could ask, chat, well, not ChatGPT, but like chat music or whatever you want to call it. I mean, like the generative AI technology, and I was talking about, draft a tango, like, based on the 5 most popular tango tunes. And he was saying that could be kind of like a first draft, and then he could sort of change that and mold it as he saw fit. And then the question again would be, I mean, I guess, okay, well, let's say that he starts doing that and he stops composing himself. I mean, is he still the composer of this new music, or should those tango composers get some of the credit, or what? So that's a big topic that at least some people in the music industry are worried about. Obviously, I mean, there was this big strike, the Hollywood screenwriters, as you may have heard, the longest strike for a very long time, where one of the complaints they had was, who exactly should get paid when generative AI is used in screenwriting. The screenwriters were also worried that they were going to be replaced by generative AI. And this was a concern also with Björn and music, whoever wrote the training data, so to speak, the scripts or the music in this case, how will they be compensated? Will they be compensated? Okay, so those are issues to do with credit for outputs by generative AI. I think a lot of you may possibly have seen this image. If not, this is an image, I'm calling it an image rather than a photograph, that won a photography competition. However, it's created with generative AI, and the artist, Boris Eldagsen, that is a photo of him on the other side there. He, after he won this prize, said, I'm going to give the prize back because this isn't a photograph. I created this using generative AI. I shouldn't get credit for being a good photographer. Maybe you could call me, he said, a good promptographer, because he put in lots of prompts and he was sort of adjusting the prompts until he got to this image, which indeed, I mean, it's striking enough that whoever was on the jury said, okay, this is the best photograph, and so he will win the first prize. But again, he was arguing that the artist, shouldn't get credit for being a good photographer because this isn't a photograph. So maybe it's promptography, it's not photography. So he was arguing that, yes, give me credit, but this is a different skill. I don't deserve credit for being good at photography. Okay, one more example to do with training data. So Sarah Silverman, as a comedian that you may be familiar with, she's also written a book. And then there were some less known authors that, well, they're not just known as the novelists here. They sued OpenAI because they alleged that OpenAI has been trained on their books, which is copyrighted material. So it means that either you ask for permission and you pay the authors, or you don't use it. OpenAI, I think, hasn't said anything about whether or not they had actually trained ChatGPT on this, because I mean, if they had, that is an infringement of copyright. And so, but I'm interested in this case is because it's another case where the question of who exactly gets the credit, both in terms of sort of, I don't know, being recognized as the author behind something, but also gets paid for the output. Okay, so I was speaking about a few cases where the issue is about who gets credit, who maybe gets the praise, who gets paid. There are, of course, also cases where people do things with generative AI for which they are blamed. And so here's an interesting example that some of you may have seen. A few months ago, The Guardian and other newspapers were reporting that mushroom collecting books were being sold on Amazon. mushroom season was coming up, and people want to go out and collect mushrooms. Maybe they haven't done it before, so they need tips. It's quite important that you get good and reliable tips, given that some mushrooms are actually dangerous and poisonous enough that you might actually die if you eat them. And so indeed, real mushroom experts had noticed that some of these books were making recommendations that were very dangerous, and the books had been, well, co-authored, if you will, by ChatGPT. ChatGPT doesn't know anything about mushrooms. Apparently, the people who used ChatGPT to write these books also didn't know enough about mushrooms. And so, however, they were very much blamed because they should have checked, are these safe tips? Can people really eat these mushrooms? So that was a case where it was thought that it was very dangerous and very bad and very blameworthy to use this technology. Okay, now you may also get blamed for using ChatGPT or other forms of large language models or generative AI for writing things, not because the content is false, but because people find it unfitting or unsuitable to use these technologies rather than writing yourself. So here's another news story. So Vanderbilt University, they sent out an email to all the members of staff and also the students talking about a mass shooting at a different university. And they were heavily criticized, and they actually apologized because people felt that this is not the sort of thing that should be written with the help of ChatGPT. It should come from the heart or something like that. Even if maybe the email was nicely crafted and it didn't contain any false information, it just didn't seem like the sort of thing that you should be using large language models to produce. And here you can talk, I'm going to talk about meaning later, and partly the sort of the linguistic meaning of things. But when we think about art and language and music, etc., there's also meaning in the sense of sort of the social significance and what's the message that's being sent. What does a text, a piece of art, or an image, what does it mean in a broader sense? And here it's interesting to think about whether it would change the meaning of messages if they're written, by or with the help of generative AI, where the generative AI doesn't itself understand, perhaps, well, on the one hand, not the linguistic meaning, something that would say something about, and also that they might not understand the social significance or meaning. Okay, so people were very much blamed, and they felt that they had to apologize. Okay, so this is all just to kind of set the scene a little bit. So I'm going to talk about meaning. I'm going to talk about blame and credit and authorship. And I think that there are some interesting gaps with respect to all of these things, in the sense that, when humans, if you have a human who has written something, there, the relation between the human and the meaning of what they have written or produced is of a certain kind that there are people working on this in philosophy and linguistics, etc. So, I mean, it's an interesting topic. They are the authors, and they can get credit or blame for what they have produced. But what if the output is produced very much with the help of or by a generative AI technology? What's the relation between it and the meaning of the output? Who's the author? Who gets credit and blame? Now, these things have been discussed a little bit so far actually more than a little bit, because the academic journals they're exploding with new philosophy papers, and not just philosophy, all possible fields, but my discipline is philosophy, so that's why I'm keeping track of it. And as Krista was mentioning, I'm also the associate editor of a journal, and we indeed get lots of submissions to do with this. Now, I think that instead of just thinking about one topic at a time, it's also interesting to think about how all these things are related to each other. If you have a certain view of the relation between generative AI and meaning, how should that affect how you think about authorship, how you think about credit and blame, and so on and so forth? And how does that relate to and or differ with how you think about the same thing if it's a human? Now, of course, in a certain sense, this is not exactly a false dichotomy, but the real way to think about it is, of course, in a human plus a generative AI technology, because they don't do anything by themselves. You have to prompt them. However, the role of the human can be smaller or bigger. So you could imagine someone who writes one sentence of a text using, let's say, ChatGPT, or someone who puts in a prompt and lets ChatGPT write the whole text, or create the whole image, or create the whole song, or whatever it might be. So the role of the human can be bigger or smaller. And I think that makes a big difference to questions about credit and blame, authorship, and meaningfulness. Now, I also think that these are concepts that we use, well, we have used up until now when we think about human products. By products, I mean like text or images or music, whatever. So the question is whether these categories and the norms related to them can carry over to the new case that when we have generative AI. And at the very end, I'm going to suggest that, well, perhaps we need to, well, to say that we need new norms and concepts might be a little bit exaggerated, but we might need to expand them, to change them, to modulate them, and some new concepts might be necessary. So maybe if you rely very heavily on generative AI, you maybe are not exactly an author, but maybe you are, I don't know, a producer, a curator, or something like that, rather than an author when you produce a text or some other output. Okay, now I use this term gappiness, and where do I get that from? Well, actually, I'm getting it from a book about Shakespeare. And so actually one of my favorite academic researchers, a Shakespeare professor at Oxford, Emma Smith. So she first, back when there was something called iTunes U, so this is basically podcast, but lectures. And so she would record her lectures about Shakespeare and just put them on iTunes U. And they were so great that she was approached by, I think it's Penguin, and they said, like, you really have to kind of put those in a book form and, let's publish this. And so that's the book. And in the introduction, she talks about the topic, why should you read Shakespeare today? And she starts, well, of course, there's nice, that the English is interesting and like they're interesting topics, but what she likes, she says, is Shakespeare's gappiness. So the plays, she says, they raise more questions and they answer questions. They require a lot of interpretation because there are virtually no stage directions. And so, I mean, there is the odd one, there's the famous one, what is the exit stage right, pursued by a bear. That's the funny one that everyone knows, but that one is that's the exception that proves the rule, because that's pretty much the only stage direction. So everything else is left up to whoever's directing the play. There are very few descriptions of characters. Falstaff is described as being fat, but that's pretty much the only description. Like, you don't know what Hamlet looks like, you don't know what Macbeth looks like, and so on and so forth. So it's all gappy. It's left up to the reader or to the interpreter to fill in the details. And so she thinks that this is one of the things that makes Shakespeare fascinating. I mean, I think in the same way that this is one of the things that makes generative AI fascinating, that there are lots of gaps. There seems to be, there are outputs, but there is missing, for example, intentions of human-like kinds. There might be missing understanding of a human-like kind, and all sorts of things are missing. And yet we have something that seems to do a lot of human-like things. And when humans use these technologies, they may also not be doing some of the things. So something might be missing as opposed to when they write something or when they paint a picture, whatever. And so the gappiness is fascinating, not just in Shakespeare, but I will argue also in generative AI. Now, I also in the title have this phrase, the credit-blame asymmetry, and I've already talked a little bit about credit and blame, but let me say something already about what I mean by this. And actually, in a certain sense, I probably should have said credit-blame asymmetries, because I think there are actually lots of them. So here are two. So on the one hand, when it comes to the motives or incentives that people have, they're quite different. And so people really like getting credit for things. And there are very strong incentives, because if I'm credited with having written, you mentioned I had written a book. I mean, that means that I also get royalties. Of course, academic books, there are limits to how much you get, but still, that's actually a textbook. So I think I get more than my other books that I've written. But anyway, even if you don't get, money, you might get recognition or something like that. So there are all sorts of things that we want. Like, we want to be associated with things that, well, if people consider the book, let's say, good, if they consider it bad, I might say, well, it's actually was co-authored and maybe, he did most of the work or something like that, because it's not nice to be blamed for things. There are strong incentives. So like if I'm blamed for something I've done or some bad outcome, then people are gonna maybe want to punish me. Maybe I have to pay a fine. My popularity will go down, etc. So there are very strong incentives to say, well, it wasn't me, it was someone else. Whereas if something good happens, there's a strong incentive to say, well, yeah, I played a small part of it. Like, I get part of the credit. So that's one asymmetry, motivationally and incentive related. Now, when it comes to deserving credit for something, or deserving blame, I think in a certain sense it's a little bit the other way around. Especially if we change, like, it's not we who want to get credit and want to avoid blame, but rather now we are in the role of giving credit or blaming people. We're quite quick to blame people for things, but we really demand a lot of them before we give them credit. So for example, if you are not careful when you're driving, let's say, and you allow something bad to happen, you cause an accident because you didn't take proper care. So it's not that you tried to harm someone, to drive into someone's rose bushes, or whatever it might be. This was something that happened as an accident. That might be enough for you to be blameworthy. But if you do something and as a happy accident, a good outcome is produced, well, very seldom will you then be credited with that. You have to work for it if you want to get credit. You have to put in some effort. You have to show some sort of maybe talent or skill, and maybe you have to make some sort of sacrifice. Otherwise, why should we single you out and say, well done? So it's hard to get credit. You have to work. You have to try to produce some good outcome. It can't just be a happy accident, a side effect. Whereas when it comes to blame, it can be enough that you allow something to happen because you don't take enough care to avoid bad side effects. Of course, it also happens that people try to harm someone, but then they're more blameworthy. But if they harm someone by accident, that might be enough. And so I think that that's all super relevant to this issue about credit and blame for generative AI, because of course a lot of people are going to be quite eager to take credit for the outputs that they might produce, and they might be motivated to say that they're not to blame. And yet, for example, with the mushroom book, people were quite happy to blame them, even if whoever wrote those books didn't mean to poison people. I mean, that wasn't the intent. However, they should have taken care to check whether these books are dangerous for people or not, because the mushrooms recommended are poisonous. Now, let's say that mushroom book also had some really nice sentences, and maybe it had some good tips about mushroom collecting, but that the person hadn't really written that because that had been generated by the generative AI. Do they deserve credit for that? Well, probably not, because it wasn't their mushroom expertise. It wasn't their nice writing skills. This was produced by this computer program. Okay, so I'll return to that, but because I think that this is quite interesting to think about when we think about, who is the author of these outputs and how should we think about that. And well, I should also just do a little bit of advertisement, as actually there's quite a few authors here for a very short 3-page paper, but me and a large group, we wrote a little article about this topic, like how does these asymmetries relate to generative AI. So if someone wants to read something short, well, that's that piece. Anyway, okay. Now, I said I would talk about meaning, authorship, and credit and blame. So let's do one at a time. So let's start with meaning. And again, I mean, I'm interested here both in what you might think of as sort of linguistic, literal meaning. Like if I say hello, I mean, what does that mean? Or I say the word dog or hund, or in Swedish hund, they all have the same meaning. So that's a matter of linguistic meaning. But how you greet someone, that might also have a meaning in the sense of social significance. Am I being polite, höflich, or not, like, so that there's also the meaning in that sense. And so one question is, does ChatGPT, for example, understand the meaning, well, in the sense of the linguistic meaning, but does it also understand the social meaning of its outputs? Are the outputs at all meaningful? I mean, I should say that there are lots of people who argue that actually it produces something that looks like meaningful text, but actually isn't. That's a view that, I mean, there's actually a really good paper by someone called Fintan Mallory, Irish philosopher, who argues that actually all major theories in the philosophy of language, all what he calls meta-semantic theories, they actually imply that these outputs are meaningless. And yet he says, when you read the text, they seem to be meaningful. So we have a kind of dilemma here. They're meaningless from the point of view of these philosophical theories about meaning. For example, I mean, like externalists claim that meaning has to do with a certain relation between the world and the language producer, that you know the world and that you have experience from it, and that you are made to use the language from this interaction with the world. And let's say ChatGPT doesn't have that kind of interaction. Internalist theories say that you have to have certain kind of intentions, communicative intentions, in order for your speech acts to be meaningful. And again, there are no intentions here, and so on. So a lot of these theories imply that there's no meaning. Some of these theories have to do with animals. I don't know if people are familiar with the stochastic parrots paper. There's another one from the same authors, so Bender and Kolla, and then sometimes writing with Timothy Gebru and some others. They have a few papers where they argue that, well, actually they kind of wobble a little bit back and forth, I must say. Sometimes they seem to be saying that there's no meaning. Sometimes they seem to be saying that there might be meaning, but the ChatGPT or other language technologies, they don't understand the meaning of what they're producing. And when they talk about that, they sometimes make use of an updated version of the Chinese room. So people may know this. Searle was discussing symbolic AI back in the 80s. And so he was saying, let's say that Searle is in the room. He has a rule book. These are the rules for Chinese sentence construction. He gets messages. He doesn't know what it means because he doesn't understand Chinese, but he can follow the rules. He can produce outputs and he sends them out, and this guy understands Chinese. So it looks like whoever's in this Chinese room understands Chinese. So even if he's a conscious being who can follow rules, that doesn't mean that he understands what the rules are about. Something else is required. And so Emily Bender and Alexander Kolla have an updated version, which is, I don't know if people have heard this thought experiment. It's quite well known in linguistics. It's very complicated, so I'm not sure I'm going to do it justice, but instead of Searle in a Chinese room, there's now an octopus, very intelligent, conscious, but it's an octopus that lives on the bottom of the ocean. It's never been on the surface. So it's never seen palm trees. It's never seen men or women or the sun, etc. It just knows what it's like to be on the bottom of the ocean. However, it's very good at detecting patterns. And these two people who are, sadly for them, cast away on the desert islands, they have a sort of a telegraph table. And so they send these Morse code messages back and forth. And so this very intelligent octopus is sort of picking up on the patterns, and it sort of starts to sort of understand that, okay, when this beeping pattern comes from A, then B is likely to respond with a certain beeping pattern. Like, I mean, I don't understand Morse code. It's like short and long signals, and that somehow symbolizes language. And one day it decides, okay, I'm going to try my skills. And so it cuts the wires and it sort of inserts itself. So it starts answering when A produces messages, it answers, and so A thinks that this is B talking, but it's really the octopus. Now, the problem is that it's never seen any of the things that they're talking about, so it just knows what kind of patterns follow which patterns. So it actually doesn't know what it's talking about. And one day, actually, did it the wrong way. So it's A who has to cut off. So B is still talking because one day a bear comes. So again, I didn't come up with this example. This was a Bender and Koller. So B says in a panic, like, what can I do? Like, how can I save myself from the bear? I have some fire, I have a palm tree and a stone, like, what can I do? But the octopus, of course, can't give any tips because it doesn't know anything about the world. It just knows about these patterns. I mean, this part of the story, I'm not sure what it adds. I mean, the main point really you already have here, it has patterns, but it has never seen any of these things, so it doesn't know what it's talking about. Okay, now, this is supposed to show that there might be a kind of illusion of meaning. So one side of the communication, the human, to them, when you speak, let's say with ChatGPT, it may look as if you're talking with something that understands what it's saying, but it's really like the octopus. I mean, it's been trained on all sorts of patterns without necessarily knowing what it's talking about, because it hasn't been out in the world and learned like a human has. And so this is a quote from the other paper, but the one about stochastic parrots. Contrary to how things may seem, there is actually just the stitching together of patterns without any actual reference to meaning. So what we're dealing with here, they argue, is a stochastic parrot. So according to this way of thinking, the outputs are really a kind of meaningless nonsense. Now, again, they sometimes talk as if they mean that there's no meaning to the output. Sometimes they talk as if the generative AI technologies don't understand the meaning. From my point of view, even the weaker thesis that there is meaning here, but the technology doesn't understand the meaning, that's already enough for it to be gappy in one of the senses that I'm interested in. Like, there's something missing So let's say that, if you were introducing me before, I'm assuming that you knew what you were talking about roughly, because I think that there's some, there's information in your head, so to speak, and when you speak, you're using information that you're getting from somewhere, and so there's some sort of shared knowledge. And if we try to coordinate meeting up for lunch later, so we might, it's important that we are able to sort of send messages from one head to another, so that we understand what we're talking about. According to them, none of that is going on, because there are no intentions, there are no beliefs, there are no desires, etc. There's no planning in this technology. So there's something missing in terms of language production. Even if they produce beautiful looking sentences, sometimes informative, sometimes they're hallucinations, sometimes it's all bullshitting, some people argue, because the technology cannot care about anything. Hence, it cannot care about what it says is true or false. And the definition from the philosopher Harry Frankland of bullshit is saying things without caring about what you're saying. So from that point of view, this is all, well, so-called bullshit, even if it could be that some of it is true. Okay, now, not everyone thinks that that's a good view, this is how we should think about things. So we have David Gunkel, who was actually in Munich a couple of weeks ago. We had a little workshop, and Mark Kokelberg, who's based in Vienna. They respond that, well, not all kinds of, so I was talking about, let's say, we try to coordinate a lunch meeting, let's say. Really important that if let's say, Christoph says, like, let's meet at the place where we met last time or something like that. It's really important that we both know what he means by that. But if he writes a poem, they say, then maybe what his communicative intentions are may or may not matter. We don't know what Shakespeare, to go back to Shakespeare, we don't know what he meant, because he didn't leave any writing behind except for his publication, so to speak. But nevertheless, this is Shakespeare and other books. There's a whole industry interpreting what Shakespeare is saying and what the meaning is of his plays. And so they say, well, what we can use this idea from Roland Barthes and like in sort of literary criticism, the so-called death of the author, the idea that you can interpret meaning without worrying about the communicative intentions. And they suggest, well, maybe that's how we should think about the outputs of large language models. We forget all the stuff about what the intentions are. Let's just interpret the text as we might with Shakespeare's text, for example. Now, they also say, let's look at Foucault. And he has this discussion about what exactly is an author. What's the function? What's the author function, as he puts it? Like, why do we attribute books? Well, as it was mentioned, I wrote a book that's called "This is Technology Ethics." Why do we say that I wrote the book? What's the deal with that? Like, what's the point? And so they are suggesting, well, if we think about that, we can see that for some texts, it doesn't really matter who the author is, because there's no particular author function that has to be fulfilled, or there might even be author functions that can be fulfilled by large language models. Now, just a quick comment about this. I think it is interesting to think about whether literary theory can be helpful here, but again, some types of communication, such as trying to coordinate for a lunch meeting, it's not like literature. It really matters what one's intentions are. So they might be right that this works for some types of communication, but definitely not for all. But let's go to Foucault, and let's now transition to the question about whether, well, first of all, can an LLM be an author? And if so, can it fulfill an author function in the Foucauldian sense? Now, I don't know if people have read this essay, What's an Author? And it's actually quite a nice essay. I recommend it. It is, of course, very Foucauldian in the sense that, why does he think that we attribute things to people? Well, so we can punish them, because Foucault loves talking about punishments. And so he says that at a certain point in history, people started being seen as the author of things, because if they wrote something transgressive, that was a way of sort of tying them to the thing so that we can then punish them. And this is also very Foucauldian. It has to do with power and authority. So if I put out a book about technology ethics, and I am not teaching at a university, but I do something completely different, I don't know, I'm a baker, then you might say, well, where's my authority here? Write a book about baking instead. Or if it's a medical treatise, then we want to see Dr. So-and-so as the author. It gives authority. So according to Foucault, these are the two main functions. You want to punish people and you want there to be an authority behind the output. Now, I would suggest that Foucault doesn't care enough about what I've been calling credit. Again, if you do write something, you don't just want to be punished for it. You yourself might want to be recognized. You might want to be paid. Like you go back to Björn Ulvaeus and this, or in the Hollywood script writers, they are not just looking to be punished. They are looking to be paid and recognized for their work. So the question is whether, well, if we're thinking about whether, like, how does generative AI relate to all of this? Let's not just look at punishment and authority. Let's also look at the issue of credit that I talked about at the beginning. Now, ChatGPT has been credited as a co-author on actually quite a few articles now. I think maybe not 20, but let's say more than 10. However, some of the the two biggest scientific journals, Nature and Science, they say actually it doesn't fit with our authorship criteria. And so this is a kind of simplified version of the criteria they have, but they say if you want to be an author, you have to have made a substantial contribution. A lot of the content, whether it's text or whether it's something else, has to come from your work. You have to be able to approve of the final version of the text, and you have to be able to be accountable for it. So, like a little bit for code in here, like you've been held to account. And some people say, yes, something like ChatGPT could make a substantial contribution because you could put in prompts, you could copy and paste the text, and you could put that in your academic paper. Sure. However, it can't approve the final version of the paper because it cannot approve anything, and it cannot be held accountable because it's not an accountable agent. I mean, I might add, based on the reflections that I just talked about, but that it also doesn't understand the meaning of the article. And to be an author of a scientific paper, maybe you should be able to understand the paper. If you can't understand it, how can you be a scientific author, you might say. Now, I should say, however, that there are some philosophers, such as Patrick Lynn, Ryan Jenkins, who say, well, let's not be so strict here. If ChatGPT or some other large language model makes a substantial contribution and a human would get credit if they made that contribution, maybe that's enough. So that's their revised theory of co-authorship. And why do they think that we can skip these two criteria? They say, well, sometimes an author dies. I mean, the philosopher Kant, or Hemingway for that matter. I mean, Hemingway wrote lots of things that have been published after it's dead. There's one that's called Islands in the Stream. Song was written based on that title, but Hemingway was there first, and so that's been published afterwards. Or think about Kafka. Actually, Kafka's an interesting case because he didn't approve. And yet after, well, so let's put Kafka aside. I mean, so Hemingway could have approved, but he didn't because he's dead. And so yet we say that Hemingway wrote these things, and he can't be held accountable because he's dead, and yet he's the author, they say. Now, I don't know about this, because if Hemingway were to come back from the dead, he could be held to account, and maybe he can even retroactively be held to account because he can be treated as if he's a person, so that if he were here, he would have something to answer for, and he could or not approve of the text if he were here. So I'm a little bit skeptical, especially when it comes to scientific writing. Okay, now, well, what about humans? Well, we can understand the text's meaning, we can approve of it, and we can take accountability. So maybe we can say that, well, we are the authors of these outputs created by generative AI. So maybe, okay, so we should never list ChatGPT as a co-author, but maybe if I use it, since I understand the meaning, I can approve the text and I can be accountable, I can be the author. Well, that's where we get back to this thing, but credit and blame, I think. I would agree, as I said before, that you can be accountable and maybe blamed because you allow misinformation to be spread, etc. But as I said at the beginning, I mean, one of the criteria for getting credit for something is that you actually showed some sort of talent, that you put in some effort, perhaps even made some sort of sacrifice, and that you actively produced a good outcome. It can just be that you allow it. Whereas if you rely very heavily on generative AI, maybe that means that you have to put in less effort. You just have to create the right prompts. You have to show less talent, less skill, and you maybe have to make less of a sacrifice, and you have to be less active. So all these kind of criteria that we usually associate with getting credit for something don't seem to be fulfilled. And again, that's what we discussed in this paper. Now, what if you have actually done the work in the past, and so you fine-tune a large language model on your own past work, but maybe then you have put in the effort in the past, you have shown the talent, and you have made some sort of sacrifice. And so now, and actually this does work. I mean, one of my colleagues at LMU, Anna Strasser, with the permission of Dan Dennett, the famous philosopher, trained a large language model on the he's written many books and articles and produced what she called DigiDan. And so if you ask a question to the real Dan or to DigiDan, actually even people who are experts on his philosophy have trouble telling which bit of text is produced by Dan and which is produced by DigiDan. She visited my class to talk about this. The students all thought that Dan Dennett was DigiDan and vice versa. They couldn't tell the difference, but they also tested people who professed to be Dennett experts, and they also couldn't tell the difference. Now, this was indeed, and so you can do this, but the problem, well, not the problem, but the issue here is that they train it on someone else's work. But actually, one of my colleagues with whom I wrote this paper about asymmetry of credit and blame, he and his co-authors then, and not with me in this case because I don't agree with this, they said, well, what if you train it on yourself? And so, for example, Brian Earp and Julian Savulescu, they have published a lot of bioethics articles. And so he, Sebastian Porstaman, he's more of a beginning academic, so he has maybe like 5 or so publications. So for him, they tried to fine-tune. For him, it didn't work very well. But for Brian and for Brian Earp and Julian Savulescu, they actually created sort of fine-tuned versions of a large language model that could write in their style. I mean, they did have an appendix where they show what they came up with, and actually the content isn't very good still. But they argue that if we can make it better, and you can have it like a large language model that produces text in your style, well, then maybe you can take credit for it because you did do the work in the past, you did put in the effort, etc. Well, I think there are 2 problems. One is that it still actually doesn't work very well because the content is still, it's hallucinating, it's coming up with all sorts of false claims or things that they wouldn't want to say. And so it writes in their style, but their arguments are still better than the arguments produced by their digital twins. However, if it did become very good, then of course that also means that, well, can they really take credit anymore? Because like, let's say that I produce a really good chatbot that writes in my style. It's been trained on what I've written so far. And it could be that my capacity to write actually decline because maybe I get hit over the head. And so like I stop being able to write something. I could still maybe put in prompts that would make it sound like me. And so, why am I getting the credit? I mean, or I die and other people put in prompts and it keeps writing this text in my style. And so at this stage, it might seem like my digital twin, so to speak, should really be seen rather as some sort of co-author or collaborator than something that directly is to my credit. But on the other hand, we have already argued that by the criteria that most scientific journals use, a large language model cannot be a co-author. So we seem to have another gap here. Okay. Now, well, Sebastian Porstaman and company, they talk about themselves as possibly enhancing themselves if they're using large language models fine-tune on their writing. I mean, I'm interested in the issue of, are they actually, rather than giving themselves more skills, are they making themselves what you might call artificially intelligent? Because like, let's say that I, from now on, write all my work by having a language model trained on my past work, producing the outputs. Then from the outside, it might look as if I'm still an intelligent and capable author, but it's like a computer. I'm doing something that I don't necessarily understand. So from the outside, I look as if I'm intelligent, which in a certain sense, it's one of the definitions people sometimes use of artificial intelligence, behaving as if you're intelligent without, I mean, it's actually Flaherty, he now argues that you should say, there's no need to be intelligent if you're an AI system. You just have to be an agent that can perform in a way that looks intelligent. Intelligence has nothing to do with it. And it could be the case that if I really lose all my capacity as a scientific author, I could perhaps still be good enough at prompting that I can create outputs that from the outside might look as if I still have, whatever level of scientific competence, is expected of a researcher, and so I can have a sort of artificial intelligence. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, I'll probably start concluding, but okay, so there are lots of gaps here. These technologies don't understand the meaning of what they're saying. They cannot be authors, and we perhaps cannot really get credit for the outputs if we use these technologies. We have lots of gaps. So what should we do about this? And let me really quickly just say, these ideas about meaning, authorship, etc., credit and blame, they really came about before we had generative AI. Now we live in a world with generative AI, so there's no guarantee that they're going to carry over in a nice way. And so either maybe we have to stretch our ideas about meaningfulness and authorship, etc., to make them also fit the new situation, or we might need new concepts or new norms. And I think we should be a little bit conservative. There's no need to stretch these things super thin. So what we might need in the end are actually new ways of thinking about, are you an author, or are you a producer, or a curator, or what? I mean, think about hip hop. I mean, if I produce hip hop records, am I a musician? Well, maybe in a broad sense, but a lot of hip hopper people, they call themselves producers, and what they're doing is not playing an instrument. The instrument is the sampling, the beats, etc. So they're doing something new, and so we need new categories for thinking about hip hop artists. In the same way, you might need new categories to think about authorship in the age of generative AI. All right, so we talked about everything from ABBA to parrots to octopi, I guess is the plural, to Foucault, and so. Sorry for going over a little bit on the time, but I had lots of things to say about this. So let's talk about it a little bit, and thanks a lot for the attention.
Yeah, thank you very much for this really fascinating. And actually, we are in a position that we can hold someone accountable. You know that we can hold Patrick Lynn accountable, because he will be talking here in 2 weeks.
Great.
And okay, let me have your questions and. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. What's that?
Thank you very much. That was super interesting. My question is more, maybe if you have comments about the idea of seeing generative AI rather like a cyborg kind of enhancement of humans, rather than seeing it as an entity in itself, literally just a tool to improve human abilities, like any cyborg tool would be.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. I mean, I think that could be one way of reading those authors who were claiming that you can enhance yourself by starting to use something like a language model trained on your own work. Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. I mean, I wrote another paper about that, and the question then is a little bit like, should you think in terms of the extended mind? And actually, I saw David Chalmers give a presentation about this recently, and he actually thinks that language models, they work in a sort of too independent way of us. And so some of the criteria that they had in the original paper from '98, whatever it is, Clark and Chalmers, there has to be a sort of a codependency of me and the technology. I have to rely on it in a very kind of like intuitive way, so I don't doubt it. And there were some criteria, and according to him, those criteria are not fulfilled by large language models, at least not in an obvious way. So at least one of the founding fathers, so to speak, of the extended mind theory is skeptical about the cyborg idea, at least if interpreted along those lines. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting idea. I mean, the computer part of your brain that's based in your phone is doing the hard work, then maybe you deserve less credit for the output, and maybe no one deserves credit for it. I mean, maybe whoever wrote the training data, so to speak, it's like whoever wrote all this text, etc., they are the ones that really deserve credit. And so credit may travel elsewhere, but blame may stay where you are as you become the cyborg.
Just one question in between. Is it a question of how complex are the prompts that you put in? I mean, this seems to me a central point, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So like, I mean, remember that guy who said that he was a good promptographer, and indeed, I mean, he did produce a very striking image striking enough that the jury of that competition said that he's the best photographer. Whereas like if I used whatever program he used, I probably wouldn't be able to produce something comparable. In the same way, I mean, to go back to the hip hop analogy, not everyone can sample other people's music and create a beat and rap, etc. to be a good hip hop artist. I mean, that's a new type of skill. And in the same way, you might say prompting or promptership rather than authorship is a new type of skill. So indeed.
Right.
Hello, first of all, congratulations, amazing talk. I'm mind blown. My question is very simple. You gave the definition of bullshit.
Yeah.
What do you mean by caring?
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, yeah, good question. Yeah, I mean, so Frankfurt, the philosopher, not the city, he, I think it was in the 80s or 90s, wrote this thing about politics, basically, like bullshitting. And so it said, like, if you really don't care about what you're saying something to impress people, you're bullshitting. And so so he has this whole big theory about what it is to care. You have to have higher order attitudes about your lower order attitude. I mean, it's quite complicated. I mean, I guess I would say that you have to have the capacity for self-reflection, and you have to be able to have attitudes about what you yourself are doing or saying, and in whatever that means. And so long as we don't think that generative AI technologies have attitudes about themselves, they can't care. I mean, do you have to be conscious, or is it enough that you sort of have some sort of, because I mean, sometimes people are behaving as if they care about something, and if you ask them, they would say, well, I don't think I care about that a lot, but their behavior suggests to you that they really seem to be noticing what they're doing and adjusting their behavior. I think that might be enough for caring. So it doesn't have to be that you have a sort of felt subjective state of caring. I mean, sometimes you have that, but at least you have to have some sort of self-reflective attitudes. And so long as we don't think that generative AI has that, then they don't care.
By the way, I don't have it.
It's over there.
Just one brief remark. Are there any people that you are talking to believe that those models can actually become conscious at some point?
Well, I'm actually, Chalmers is a good example here, because he did, in addition to giving this talk recently about whether they extend the mind, he also has another talk that he's been giving a few times about whether they can become conscious, and apparently he takes that pretty seriously. But on the other hand, he also in that same talk reviewed a long list of criteria for when something can be considered as conscious. I mean, one criteria is like it says that it's conscious, and indeed some large language models say that they're conscious, but that seems to be weak evidence at best. Another would be that you have a human-like or an animal-like brain, a nervous system that's missing here, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, actually there was some I can't remember who it was at OpenAI or one of these companies who also said that neural networks are slightly conscious. And so I don't know how seriously that was intended, but
it's a huge discussion and leading to our general extinction as human
absolutely beings. Yeah. So, but I think most people don't take it seriously.
Right. So I have two short questions. One, isn't an unavoidable problem in much of this analysis is that it assumes that generative AI is a static thing, but it keeps advancing in really major ways every 6 months.
Yeah.
And that gives a very short shelf life to anything we say about it right now. And the second question is for instance, take AI agents. So if you use the same authorship criteria, the same credit blame asymmetry analysis with AI agents, it changes because you can within a virtual world. So there was this paper that had AI agents run in a Westworld-like scenarios where they talk to each other, and you can imagine a scenario where you can assign blame and credit to an AI agent within a virtual world.
Yeah.
So many of these criteria change with AI agents.
Yeah, no, okay, so to take one question at a time. I mean, I do agree that some of the things I said, well, I was also reporting a lot of arguments like from Bender and Kohler, etc. Some of those things may indeed change over time so that maybe they can become, meaning the generative AI agents, maybe they can become authors by some of this criteria. So that may change over time. I think the stuff that I was talking about with credit and blame, that's not going to change over time, because actually the better the generative AI technologies become, maybe the less we have to do. So it's going to be even more the case that we get less credit for it, and yet we may allow these things to cause harm, because we continue using them, and so the blame might still be there. So the point about the credit blame asymmetry, I think, is going to remain like, you know, on the shelf for a long time, and maybe even become stronger. Whereas some of these things about, does it understand meaning? Well, actually, like in the human-like sense, so that might still be there for on the shelf for quite some time. But yeah, you're right. I would say that if you make a list of the claims, some of them have a shorter shelf life, some of them have a longer shelf life. The second question, I don't remember at this point. I must. If these rules apply to. Oh, I see. Can they be? Yeah. AI agents within a virtual world. Yeah, I mean, virtually, maybe yes. I mean, we can play a kind of game where they praise and blame them, and then we can ask, does it have the same social role as blame and praise of humans? Different question.
Because we don't have much time.
We can talk afterwards.
Thanks. Very interesting talk. I was wondering if you also looked into copyright law for some of these issues, because authorship as well as credit and blame are issues that are covered by copyright law. For example, we have a whole concept of derivative works where the original author as well as the one creating the derivative work has authorship on their individual productions. Yeah. And also under copyright law, giving authorship to a dead person has never been a problem. And all the credit or blame would come then either to the estate of the dead person or the person who he or she has left his or her rights to.
Yeah, no, I mean, I actually, I mentioned there was like a really long list of authors in that short paper that I wrote with some colleagues. I mean, we did have some people who look at copyright law indeed, and I myself have no expertise in copyright law, so I've had colleagues who I've worked with who have looked at that, and I think it's quite interesting indeed. I mean, I mentioned Kafka briefly, and so he's an interesting case because, I mean, he specifically said, don't publish my stuff after I'm dead. I don't take responsibility, and yet people did, and they say he's the author. So, I mean, actually, someone brought it up when I gave this talk in Bern, actually, and that was a nice point. And so, but I think that also illustrates that when it comes to literature, I mean, this is part of the mystique and the aura of Kafka, like part of the charm, so to speak. But when it comes to scientific authorship, we might use different criteria. And it could be that the copyright laws applied in the same way, but when it comes to the social role of authorship, to use the kind of Foucauldian idea of the function of authorship, that may differ in terms of whether it's literature, is it poetry, is it a shopping list, what kind of communication is it?
Short follow-up. Always be the case, for example, and the copyrights are also given for computer programs. And then depending on who has the copyright over the computer program, there is also a liability in terms of harm caused or wrong information given, as would happen in a scientific publication. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, there are, in addition to the issue of liability, there has also been some cases where the issue of whether authorship in a more positive sense should be afforded like patents and things like that. I think there was one court in Australia who said that AI can be like an inventor, but then in America and a few places there was decided no, it has to be a human. So yeah, you're right, there's the stuff about liability, but there's also some interesting legal developments related to the positive side of the coin as well. Again, I personally am not an expert, but I'm trying to follow that from a kind of layman's perspective.
More questions, comments?
Okay.
Hassan Murad, I work in developing, designing digital learning content. So we use a lot of tools to produce the content, but the knowledge stays with the subject matter expert who's providing that knowledge. So if AI is used, if generative AI is used as a tool, is there any ethical question about this? And is it do you agree that the ethical issues rise from it being generative rather than intelligent? Because it's producing something that's...
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I think there could also be other ethical issues to do with intelligent technologies, but I think indeed the fact that it's generative creates its own set of issues, especially when it comes to, well, in your case, with students learning skills. I mean, again, the more you use a tool that generates something for you, the less you have to learn the skill of generating the same thing. And so It could very well that students become really good at prompting, as you were suggesting before, but that they may lose some of their capacities for analytical thinking, or maybe even to express themselves in writing and in speech, because they're.
We use the tools to produce the learning content.
Oh, I see. On your side as well. Well, I mean, yes. I mean, then you might get the same words about the teachers. I mean, that they might become lazy and rely so heavily on these things that they actually, like, their skill levels goes down, because most skills, requires that I mean, my wife is a violinist. She has to practice the violin all the time to stay at that level, and in the same way, the teachers, I mean, the more they generate their assignments using generative AI, the less maybe they have to hone their skills in these areas. And so, I mean, that might be an ethical problem if that means that when then they later assess the student work, they might actually be less able to assess it in a kind of informed and fair way. So yeah, I do think that the fact that it's generative creates its own set of problems that, I mean, obviously there are also interesting ethical issues to do with intelligent technologies, but on the other hand, some people maybe would define intelligence in terms of being able to generate new things from materials. That might be one of the definitions. Again, I should say that some people say, again, like Luciano Floridi, who I think has been here a few times at TUM speaking about this type of topic. I mean, he thinks that we should skip the whole talk about intelligence here, because I mean, he uses this example of a dishwasher. It's like when I do the dishes myself, I use a certain method. When the dishwasher washes dishes, it's a completely different method. And so when I write a text, I use my intelligence. And when a generative AI technology writes a text, it uses something else. I mean, some people would say, well, that's a different kind of intelligence. But there's an interesting discussion here about whether we should. I mean, I'm quite fascinated by that idea, and I want to think more about it. But yeah, so intelligence might not be, well, from some point of view, it's the right term, but nevertheless, there's generation of new content, and there's processes that people might sometimes call it also. I mean, creativity is another thing. Is this creative or is this something else? When I write a text or produce a nice picture or a song, I might have to use my human creativity. When generative AI does the same thing, well, it might be looking for patterns in the training data or whatever. Is that creativity? Well, if so, then of a different kind, perhaps. Although some people say, well, that's what we are doing also when we are being creative. So like people have different views about that too. One more question.
My question that is, when we're talking about blame, usually it comes associated when we're talking about humans with shame, right? What could be the parallel to large language models, LLMs?
Okay, well, so this is one of the reasons why, so there was a question before about whether you can have virtual agents being blamed or praised for what they're doing. And so some people say, I mean, we can praise or blame, we can say like bad computer or whatever, but it can't be ashamed of what it's done, or it can't feel guilty. I mean, so you're mentioning shame, and guilt is another thing. Shame is often associated with an assessment of oneself as being defective in some way. Guilt is associated with thinking about one of one's actions or set of actions is defective, something that one should feel guilty about. And that is often seen as requiring consciousness and emotions of sorts that a lot of people think that intelligent computers or robots cannot have. And so this is why I said before that the social function of praise and blame might be different. And so again, so we can blame this virtual agents all we like, but that may play quite a different role than if you and I blame each other. That's supposed to kind of, I don't know, modulate the way we interact, and maybe moving forward with there's certain things we don't do anymore, etc. I guess you could say the same thing here, where we can this could be a kind of machine learning, like I blame the computer, and so that it will stop performing bad actions, but it would still not have the sort of the emotions that you might have if I blame you, or you might get angry with me because you think I don't deserve blame, or you might accept it and feel guilty, etc., etc. So yeah, there's a whole aspect to sort of human interaction to do with these things that is sort of missing, I think, when it comes to generative AI and other types of AI.
Brief remark.
Actually, I see an analogy also with software which allows like search engines. No, earlier on when you needed to write an article, you had to do your own physical research in a library. Now there's tools that allow it to be done very much faster, but then a human agent needs to digest that and then produce something still. And now with generative AI, when it comes to scientific authorship, there's even more information that's being used to generate a text, and it's blind. We don't know what it has used to generate that text. And that kind of enhances the duty of the human agent relying on it to make that transparent, to double check whether it's correct or not. And just the way we would not blame Google or any other search engine for mistakes in the references, it has to be from the author. In the same way, I guess the human agent will still need to be held responsible, the one who's using it.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the things you're accountable for when you are an author, you know, that you really have the sources that actually match up with the contents that you claim is discussed in the sources. I mean, your comment also made me think, some people say that, okay, it's great because now we don't have to do a literature review. We can ask generative AI to write, you know, what have people said in the literature. And so we can just focus on our research. But I think that's a problem because, I mean, part of coming up with ideas for your own research is to actually read other people's work, try to make new connections, etc. And so you might sap some of the creative thinking from people, like when they actually don't study the literature, they just go to a summary and then they think that they can come up with good ideas. I mean, so a lot of people who are quite creative, they tend to read a lot and read broadly. And this is something you often hear from these people, and that like they read all sorts of things that you think, you know, why are they reading about that? But it's, you know, it stimulates thinking and creativity. And so it's not exactly respond to your question, but I worry that the more, like, it goes back to your point about education a little bit, like not actually reading things and checking that the sources are really good sources. It's not just, you know, being accountable. It's also like, you know, your own thinking stimulated by doing that. And so, yes, you become more accountable, but you also help yourself in a certain sense because, you know, you come up with these new ideas, etc., etc.
Right. I think we have to wrap up, but one final example comes to my mind. You mentioned ABBA.
Yeah.
We could also mention the Beatles. And this was not, I mean, they did not use generative AI, obviously, but there was AI involved in the recreation, or what you can call it, this last Beatles song. But I mean, John Lennon could not approve of the final song. And even at that time, when George Harrison was involved, and he did not approve, explicitly said, no, we should not publish at that time. But then there was a lot of technology involved in recreating the song, and probably they would have now, but we don't know for sure. And so,
yeah, no, that's an interesting case. And indeed, some people said that, well, George didn't like it at the time. But I mean, so then the question would be, well, would he now like it now that it's, you know, we can use these technologies? I mean, would Lennon like it? His son said, yeah, he would probably love it, but well, hard to say. But yeah, so that's an interesting alternative way. But where some of these questions about you know, approving did come up.
and holding accountable.
Absolutely.
So what crappy recording did you do in your New York apartment in the 70s?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much again, Sven, for accepting our invitation, and for all of you for joining us and contributing to the discussion. Many thanks, of course, to the TUM think tank for their hospitality. Stay tuned for exciting talks to come. We will continue to welcome distinguished guest speakers. And our next one, as I said already, will be Patrick Lin from California. And he will speak here on November 30th at 11 a.m. about how technology unlocks frontiers and ethical dilemmas, the case of outer space. Thank you, Sven, for today.
Well, thanks again from my side as well. Thank you.